Welcome to the iCapGen video, Writing an Effective Research Report. Hello, my name is Diana Elder, and I'm an accredited genealogist professional specializing in the Gulf South region of the United States. Today we're going to talk about writing a research report. And this quote by Linda K. Gould-Branson, accredited genealogist professional, gives us an idea of why we should do this. The time you spend in synthesizing thousands of facts and minutiae into comprehensive, meaningful reports or articles will constitute some of the most valuable time you spend as a genealogist. So let's talk about why we should write up our research. There are three main reasons. First is to make connections in your research and prove conclusions. It's an interesting thing that sometimes it's not until you start writing that you actually figure out those connections that you've found in your research, and putting it on paper helps your brain to make those connections and figure out what you have found. Also, we want to demonstrate the breadth and excellence of our research. We want to show that we have thought to look at a variety of sources, and we want to show that we have done our due diligence in trying to perform reasonably exhaustive research. And finally, we need to preserve and share our research. If we don't do something to write up our research, then future generations will have no idea what we were thinking when we put together our family group sheets or our pedigree charts, because often we have indirect evidence proving difficult relationships. Unless it is written down, there's no way for anyone else to understand what we were thinking. Before you start writing, it's important to think about who will be reading your research findings. You need to keep your audience in mind so that you can write in the appropriate style. So here are some ideas of potential people who could be your audience. You might be writing for a client. In that case, you'll probably be writing a research report. You might be writing for fellow genealogists and be writing a 4-generation report for accreditation or an article for a genealogy quarterly. Perhaps you're going to be writing for other family members, and this would take the form of a family history book. Or you could be writing for anyone because you're going to do a proof summary or proof argument that you can upload on Family Search or another online tree. Or you might just be writing for yourself, recording your own personal research notes. Often this is something that we overlook and could be the most important writing we do as genealogists. As you start writing, you want to be sure that you know what voice you're going to use. So you want to be consistent, whether you're using third, second, or first person. So let's take a look at each of those types of voice in writing. Third person is formal. This is what we use for family history books, proof summaries, research reports. You would have your sentence be something like, Florence Kelsey married. Now, if you want to try second person, that might be a situation where you're writing a letter report to a client. And it's less formal. It would say something like, your grandmother was married in. And then finally, if we are writing in first person, that is also less formal, and it could be used in a report or a letter where you would say something like, I discovered the marriage record of Florence Kelsey. So all of these are acceptable in various circumstances. But for our research reports, we generally use third person. So what do we do first? Well, we want to begin with a research report. We want to make sense of our research by writing the report. This is where we're going to make the connections between all the records that we have found and the individuals we are researching. This report can be for your own research notes, or it could be for a client. It also could be the basis, and it could become a proof summary, an article, or be incorporated into a book. Often we take several research reports and put those together into a proof argument. So let's talk about the different elements of a research report. We have the research objective, background information, body of the report, a conclusion, future research suggestions, and a project summary. We'll take each of these and go more in depth, discussing how each of those can be developed so that you can develop a complete research report. First of all, the objective. The objective is the foundation of your research report, and you need to clearly state the focus of the research project in your objective. You'll want to use key identifiers with complete names, complete dates, and places of the main individual. Here's an example of a research objective that I completed a project for, and it reads, the objective of this research project was to identify the father and siblings of Georgia Ann Lewis Dawson, died 1861 in Russell County, Alabama. Georgia married John W. Dawson 6 February 1850 in Russell County. So let's notice a couple things about this research objective. First of all, it contains complete names. I have Georgia Ann's maiden name as well as her married name, her husband's complete name. I've got as complete a date as I have for her death, as well as a complete marriage date, and I have complete places. So we don't use abbreviations, we spell everything out, and we make sure that everything is complete as possible. A good test for your research objective is to think about this scenario. What if you gave this to another researcher? Would they be able to perform the research that you want based on all the information in your objective? And if the answer is yes, then you know that you have a good research objective with the key identifiers and everything that you need to go forward with your research project. One of the first things to put in your research report is some background information. Put in there whatever you know about the individual or the family. Include what you had previously found out, including any family myths, and you might want to include some information about the time period or location. Include whatever you feel sets the stage for your findings. When I'm doing background information, I often do this section last because I'm not entirely sure until I have finished the research report exactly what I want to put into the background information. So don't get too hung up on having a perfect background information section of your report. You can go back and edit everything in your report. So maybe just start with some background on the family and then you can add to it when you have completed your report. Here's the example of the background that I wrote for my report on Georgia Dawson. So here's what I came up with. Georgia A. Dawson left a will in 1861 naming nieces Sarah and Mary Royston. Who was Georgia and what was her connection to the Royston family? Cynthia Dillard Royston and Thomas Beverly Royston had two daughters named Sarah and Mary Royston among their 14 children. The Royston family lived in Chambers County from 1850 to 1870. With Chambers County located to the north of Russell County, Alabama, the nieces of Georgia A. Dawson and the daughters of Thomas and Cynthia Royston could be the same individuals. If so, identifying Georgia A. Dawson could be an important step in discovering the birth family of Cynthia Dillard Royston. Could Georgia A. Dawson be a possible sister or cousin? Identifying Georgia could answer these questions. Records for Georgia A. Dawson centered in Russell County, Alabama. Russell County, Alabama was created in 1832 from land ceded by the Creek Indians. Settlers from Georgia began moving in and growing cotton in the fertile soil. The slave trade flourished with large plantations requiring numerous hands to work the labor-intensive crop. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, Russell County sent many of its men to fight for the rights of the Confederacy. So let's take a minute and analyze some of the various things that I have put into this background information. First of all, I am expounding on my objective. My objective was simple and it was clear, and all the information that I wanted to explain about this project is in the background. So I have explained a purpose of trying to connect Georgia Dawson with Cynthia Dillard Royston, looking for a connection based on her will. I've also talked a little bit about Russell County and what it was like in the 1860s, and also set the stage for a possibility of, what was happening in the county with the Civil War. Once you've done your background information, then it's time for the body of the report. and you will be doing yourself and your reader a favor if you can organize the report by subheadings. There are several different ways you can organize your report. One of those is chronological or geographical. So you may want to start with a birth record of an individual, and then the report would mention every record along the pathway of their life, ending with their death record. Or perhaps you're going backwards in time and you're mentioning their death record and moving back towards their birth. Or perhaps the family was a typical migrating family in the United States, and they began on the East Coast and ended up on the West Coast, and you could have your report organized by each location that they lived in. Now let's say that you want to organize by individual or by family group. The scenario for this would be if you were perhaps separating men of the same name in a county, and you would address each man and his records and then go on to the next and then the next. Or if you're writing a family history book, you would want to divide this up by different family groupings. And then finally, you can organize your report by record type. You can discuss the search for the land records and the court records, the probate, the census. And of course, you can do a mix of all of these different types. Every report will warrant a different organization depending on what you found and what you are trying to present. So be fluid and flexible in thinking of the best way to organize your report. As you are discussing the different records and the information that you found, you need to make sure that you're presenting the evidence that supports your conclusion. One of the ways to do this is to explain the reasoning behind searching a certain record type. For example, I wrote, the 1850 census was the first to name each member of the household, and with Georgia residing in the household of her in-laws, no census would show her with her parents. With the naming of the sisters of Georgia A. Dawson in her will, the 1850 census could possibly show them in a family group with possible parents and indirectly identify her parents. So let's analyze what I have written here. First of all, I have a sentence explaining to the client, in case they don't know, that the 1850 census was the first to name each member of the household. We have to always assume that we need to educate the client or whoever our reader is. We can't assume that they understand the records like we do. We want to always be giving a reasoning behind searching the record type. And then we also can set up a scenario with explaining what might happen if we can find the information. So in my second sentence, I explain how Georgia Dawson named her sisters, and so the 1850 census could show those sisters in a family group and could show the parents, because Georgia Dawson is not going to be named anywhere with her parents. So we also have to think of creative ways that will present our evidence to support our conclusion. Sometimes genealogy research findings can be difficult for a reader to understand, and so we want to use as many things as possible to make it very easy for them to see the information. So we can use narrative, as I've shown you in previous examples, or we can bullet point information. We can create a nice table. We can do abstracts or transcriptions to clearly show the information from the source. One is an example of maybe when you'd want to use bullet points. Well, bullet points can work really well if you're abstracting a will and you want to bullet point each person who's named in that will. For tables, a census table often is much more interesting to look at than simply a list of everyone who's in the table. And the interesting thing about using tables in your report is often when you're creating a table, it helps you to understand your information even better. Perhaps you're putting in all the land records and then you suddenly make a connection. If you're adding witnesses, you're able to start adding to that fan club of the individual because you've created a table. Now, we generally don't want to transcribe an entire will into a report, so we would take pieces out of that will, we create an abstract so that we could clearly show all the information we need, but we would leave out the boilerplate language, all of the different things that were legal terms that don't necessarily need to be in our report. Here's an example of a table with a census of the 1850 census. And I could have written this all out. I could have said something like Nolan Lewis was the head of household, and included in the household were Martha Sarah, Mary Savannah, and James M. Cole. And I could have then discussed their ages and his real estate. But how much better is it to see a visual of the census and to be able to look at those girls and see their ages? And then I can discuss how the subject of our report, Georgia, was 20 in the 1850 census in her husband's household, and how she would fit perfectly with this family, being the next older daughter from Sarah. So tables are a wonderful way to present your information and help to present evidence that's going to support your conclusion. What about those negative searches? Should we just ignore those? Well, of course not. As excellent genealogists, we include negative as well as positive searches, and we use consistent quality source citations for each genealogical statement. So let's look at that citation number 9. It reads Alabama County Marriages, and it says a negative search for Sarah Lewis and Lawton, or Savannah Lewis and Buford. So if you remember from the beginning, we have a will that discusses two sisters, and it gives their surname, their married surname. And so this described a search that I made in the Alabama County Marriages for those sisters and a gentleman of the surname. And I did not find it in that particular record set, and so I just write negative search. And then because it also was not in the Georgia marriages, I combined that into the citation, and that was also a negative search. This tells me, it tells the reader, that I have thought to look in those two databases for those marriages. And then number 10 describes a record from the Family Search family tree. And you'll notice that I have given access dates for both of these citations, which tells me the date that I actually looked at that record, so that if something changes on the website, and as we know, the Family Search family tree is collaborative, and if that individual is deleted or something changes, I have all the information in the citation to try to find her again and to know when I actually looked at that record. So you'll want to make sure that you're using consistent quality source citations, and every time you make a statement in the research report, you're following that up with a source citation. Now, as we're writing the research report, it's really important to analyze the evidence as we go. And we don't always have to use specific terms for every single piece of research that we're doing, but it's very important for us to understand the different kinds of sources. Is this an original source, or is it derivative, or is it authored? The reason it's important for us to understand and to use this terminology if needed in our reports is because we will run into conflicting information, and perhaps we are using a derivative source that is not as good as an original source, and so we would know to give more weight to the original source. And so understanding sources and how to explain those in our client reports is very important. What about the information? Again, we need to understand the types of information. Primary or firsthand, secondary or secondhand, or unknown information where we don't know who provided the information. Again, it can help us give weight to particular pieces of information when we have conflicts. It can help us to know what is most important in proving our conclusions. And finally, we have evidence. Our evidence can be direct. It can be directly answering a research question. It could be indirect, where we have to put together some different types of information to find our direct evidence, indirect evidence. Or it could be negative. Perhaps a record is not where it should be, and it is proof that an individual died if he's not in the 1830 census and he was there in an 1828 tax record. And we have to be careful that we understand negative evidence and don't just use negative evidence in place of negative results, which just means a record was not found. So understanding the correct terminology for the evidence will help us to write better reports. Now we've got to explain difficult or conflicting evidence and state conclusions about the evidence. We can't ignore evidence that doesn't quite fit with what we would like it to do. So we use things like qualifiers. We say things like possible, probable, almost certain, current hypothesis, because in genealogy you never know when a new source might be uncovered, so you generally can't prove a conclusion 100%. So in using qualifiers as we are writing the research, we're protecting ourselves as well as letting our client know that this is almost certain, but not all the way there. We need to make our reports interesting and more understandable, and one way to do that is to add applicable information on the history and the laws of the time. We can explain the context of the records. We can talk about how the land was distributed or why the census was taken. We always have to remember the client may not understand how these records were created, and so we add more information to make sense of the things that we're finding. Maps are a wonderful way to explain our findings. They can show the proximity of locations or boundary changes, and if you're trying to prove that two people are really one and the same, you may have to show a map showing how it would be completely understandable that they migrated from one location to another. Boundary changes can help the client understand why records might be in 2 or 3 different counties. So be sure to use maps to help break up the text of your report as well as to help with understanding. Here's an example of a map that I used in the Georgia Dawson report. Because I had 2 different counties where records were found, one in Georgia and one in Alabama, the client might think that these counties were far apart, when in reality they were on the border. We have Russell County in pink, and then right across the border, which is the Chattahoochee River, we have Muskogee County. And so showing this visual of a map makes it really easy for the client or the reader to understand how easy it would be for the individuals to move back and forth across that border and why the records would be kept in both states. We need to summarize the evidence. We might have given a lot of research findings, and we can't just put things out there and expect the reader to completely understand what we have put out there unless we're helping them make connections between the various pieces of evidence. We want to make sure we're using full names and few, if any, pronouns to be clear when discussing individuals. So here's an example. Locating the marriage of G.D. Royster and Mildred Lewis provided the probable older sister mentioned in the will of Georgia Ann Lewis Dawson. Georgia named nieces Sarah and Mary Royston. The surnames Royster and Royston almost certainly refer to the same family. So in this example, I had found this marriage, and I have to make a judgment call. Is Royster going to be the same as Royston? Well, combined with the other evidence that Mildred was a Lewis and that they were married in Russell County, I made the judgment call that yes, Royster and Royston are almost certainly refer to the same family. Notice I've used the qualifier almost certainly. If I wasn't as sure, I could say something like the surnames Royster and Royston possibly refer to the same family. So it's up to you as the writer to decide your level of confidence, which term you want to use. In this case, I felt very confident, and so I used almost certainly. You'll also notice that I use full names and few pronouns. So let me read this again using a lot of pronouns and see if it makes a difference. Locating the marriage of G.D. Royster and Mildred Lewis provided the probable older sister married in her will. She named nieces Sarah and Mary Royston. The surnames Royster and Royston almost certainly refer to the same family. So you'll notice when I read it using the term she and her, it made it confusing. Was I referring to Mildred as the she, or was I referring to Georgia? So we want to be sure, even though it may seem redundant, to use the names. Very few pronouns, and if you use a pronoun, make sure it's very, very clear who it's referring to. Finally, we write a conclusion. We write a clear, concise paragraph that restates the objective and summarizes the findings. We can recap the findings using bullet points if the research was complex. If it was a simple report, we may not need to write much of a conclusion. But if it was difficult, we need to be careful that our conclusion clearly leads the reader back through the research findings. Spend a lot of time on writing a good conclusion. Here's an example of conclusion that I wrote for the Georgia Dawson project. This research session was very successful in identifying Georgia A. Lewis Dawson and improving no relationship to Cynthia Dillard Royston. Georgia was found to be the daughter of Noland R. Lewis based on indirect evidence. Her will named sisters Sarah, Mary, and Savannah, who were located in the household of Noland and Martha Lewis in 1850. Noland R. Lewis is also named in the probate of Georgia's will, holding the estate sale of her property at his residence. So here I have led the reader back through my research. And because I haven't given you all of the pieces, it's a little bit cryptic for anyone watching this video. So I'll just explain a couple things here. First of all, let's look at my first sentence. This research session was very successful. We want to help the client realize that yes, this was a successful research session. And if you feel that it wasn't a successful research session, then try to find another way to frame it positively. Even if information was not found, negative results can be the stepping off point to another research project. So try to frame your conclusion in a positive manner. So if you remember, my objective was to see if I could identify Georgia Lewis and prove a relationship to Cynthia Dillard Royston. And I was found that Georgia was the daughter of Noland R. Lewis. What was that indirect evidence that I presented? Well, I had found the sisters that she named in the will in the household of Noland and Martha Lewis. Because we don't have relationships in the 1850 census, that wasn't complete proof that they were daughters, but it seemed to be. But then in examining Georgia's will, I found that Noland R. Lewis was named in her probate. He held the estate sale of her property at his residence, and he also purchased a great deal of her estate. Now, putting that piece of information together with her sisters being in his household is indirect evidence. Nothing directly states that Georgia is the daughter of Noland Lewis, but in the research report, I clearly went through each piece of evidence and explained how this indirectly proved he was her father. So I went back through this in the conclusion. The conclusion does not have source citations because everything has been cited completely in the report. Okay, here is more of the conclusion. An additional sister was discovered, Mildred Lewis, who married G.D. Royster. This would be the unnamed eldest sister whose daughters were named Sarah and Mary Royston in the will of Georgia A. Lewis Dawson. Identifying the father and siblings of Georgia successfully eliminated her as a potential sister or cousin of Cynthia Dillard Royston. Although Sarah and Mary Royston Royster were present in both families, they were clearly part of two separate Royston or Royster families. So you'll notice that I bullet pointed. I had 2 bullet points in the previous slide and 2 bullet points here. So taking the information that I presented in the report, I put it into sections using bullet points to separate it to help the client or the reader clearly understand the research findings. Now, a project summary is a useful tool, and the project summary can be included either at the beginning or after the client report. And it gives the client an opportunity to quickly review what you've learned, and it will help you, if you're hired again, to come back and do this research. If you're writing the report for yourself, it will be very beneficial because it will help you quickly remember what you found and help you get ready for the next research project. So how do we create a project summary? One thing that's very helpful is to start a separate document and then to go through your report summarizing each paragraph with thorough but concise terms. I do this with 2 monitors, with a summary document on one monitor and the report on the other. If you aren't using 2 monitors, you could split your screen or you could print out your report and use that. So I like to go through the report, and I do this in a bullet point format, and I start every sentence with an action verb. So we want this project summary to read very fluid and to the point. So instead of saying something like, I searched the census records and I found this, or the census records were searched, like we would in a research report, we simply say, search the census records located the 1850 census, and we are trying to make this concise. So one tip is to keep a list of good action verbs that you can use for your project summary. So here's an example of my project summary for Georgia Dawson. You'll notice I have the objective at the top, and then I have bullet pointed the results summary. So I will just read a couple of these results summary. Transcribed the estate case file for Georgia A. Dawson, noted family relationships and the mention of 2 deceased children and deceased mother and stepmother. Discovered Owen L. Lewson named as Georgia's brother in the probate, and Noland R. Lewis holding the estate sale at his residence. Also noted J. Cook Lewis, a witness to the will. I go on to discuss other parts, other research that I did. Notice the use of the action verbs. I have transcribed, discovered, found, located, searched, researched. Here is continuation, viewed, searched, located, searched. And you'll notice that I use complete names again. We want to make sure that we are still being very clear with complete names rather than pronouns. And when there were no results, I simply note. So in the very last bullet point, search cemetery records in Russell County, Alabama for the Dawson and Lewis family members, no results. So we can give our client the basis of the entire research project right here in the project summary, and it will help them to read through that. Then when they go to read the research report, they will already have a feeling for what has been found. Now, a research report for a client should always include ideas for the next research session. And if you are your own client and you're writing a research report for yourself, this will be invaluable as you tackle the next project. What kind of things can you use for future research suggestions? Well, you can suggest further research on extended family members found during the project. You would not want to start researching those because they're not part of your objective and they're not what the client hired you to find, but you could suggest further research. These are included, the future research suggestions can be included at the end of the report in a bullet point format for ease of use. So let's take a look at my suggestions for future research. A tip for forming these is to keep a running list as you research. As you're thinking, as you're writing your report and you're thinking about what you're finding, you'll often have ideas come to you about what future research you could perform. And so you could start that section immediately and start putting those things in. So let's look at a couple of examples here. Continue to search for cemetery records for the Dawson and Lewis family members. Expand the search to neighboring counties if necessary. So if you remember from the previous slides, no cemetery records were located yet for the Dawson and Lewis family members, and so this is a good future research suggestion. Now, I haven't discussed before Lily Dawson, but the will of Georgia Dawson centers on her daughter Lily and her brother Owen L. Lewis, who is appointed the guardian. Now we know if there is a young child and someone is appointed a guardian that there are often guardianship records. And so that's an excellent suggestion for future research, to search guardianship records. Now the Georgia Enquirer was the newspaper of the region. So possibly there's a death notice or obituary for Georgia Ann Lewis and her mother and stepmother who were also mentioned in her will. So newspaper research is a good suggestion. And then researching the Nolan Lewis family past 1860. Several of the siblings of Georgia were located on the censuses, and they could, each of them, be researched. Each of the extended family could be researched and discover more descendants. And finally, we could search Civil War records for John Dawson. Because he died in between the 1860 and 1860 census and her will of 1861, it's possible he died in the beginning stages of the Civil War, so military records could be searched. And then we could search marriage records for Nolan Lewis and his first wife, Sarah Gibson, in Georgia. So there's lots of suggestions here for future research. If this were my own research project, I could put this away for a year or two, and then I could pull it back out, and I would have the entire report, I'd have the summary, and I would have suggestions for what to do next. I wouldn't have to go through my research again trying to understand what I was doing. So some tips for excellent writing. It's always a good idea to set aside your writing for a few days and then view it with fresh eyes. Print out your report and edit it on paper. Proofread carefully for spelling, grammar, and punctuation. Eliminate trite phrases and take out excess words. As we're learning to be excellent writers, there are a lot of things that we can do to make our writing better. And these are just a few of them. And I would especially recommend printing out the report and editing on paper. There's something very different from seeing a report on paper than seeing it on a screen. I like to get out my red pen and mark up my report, make notes of what I need to add. I often find more research that I need to use to flesh out an argument. And of course, I often find the misspelling or punctuation or grammar issues. So take your time with your research reports, and you'll be able to become an excellent writer. Another good tip is to circle the passive be verbs is, are, and were, and then rewrite those sentences using action verbs when possible. And as I mentioned before, keep a list of good action verbs to use, such as determined, revealed, searched, discovered, found. So for example, you maybe wrote a sentence such as, the 1850 census was searched, and you're finding that you're using was or were or are, those be verbs, throughout the entire report, which makes it very lazy feeling. And we want our reports to be more action-packed. And so you could rewrite it saying something like, the 1850 census revealed the household of Nolan Lewis. It makes such a difference to really take a look at your verbs. And it's okay to have some of those be verbs in there. Just make sure that the entire report is not filled with them. So circling them will help you see how many you have, and it will help you to be aware of where you could put some different types of verbs. And then finally, you want to proofread for the consistent third-person voice that we talked about at the beginning of this video. Make sure you haven't let slip something like, I searched, or you would be interested in knowing. Make sure that everything is consistent. Third person. Again, sometimes things can slip into our writing, and so if we printed it out and we're looking through it, that will be very helpful. One thing you can do if you've printed out your report is you can do 3 different edits. First of all, you can edit for punctuation, grammar, and spelling, and then you can edit for wording, and then you can edit for the voice. So having a different focus each time you edit will help you to write a better report. As I've stated several times, be very clear when stating dates and names, avoiding the use of pronouns. We never want to have a question about who the he or she is referring to. If you are doing this for a client project, make sure you're budgeting plenty of time to write the report, or as I like to do, write as you research. Writing a report can often take as much time as the research. So if you have a 10-hour project and you have researched for 9 hours, you're certainly not going to have time in 1 hour to write a report, and you will end up going over on your time. So an excellent practice is to write as you research. Search a record, create the source citation for the record, put that in your research log, and then write a little summary of the research in your research report. And as you search each record type or each record, you are adding to your report, and at the very end, after you have finished your research, you can rearrange things and add your headings, add your background information, but you'll have the bulk of your report already written because you've been writing as you go. And a final tip is to practice. Write reports for your own research and have someone else read them back and provide feedback. Are they easily understood? Does the research seem credible? There's nothing like having an independent body read your writing and see if they can understand what you are trying to tell them. Give them a red pen and have them mark up your research report with questions about what you're referring to and things that they don't readily understand. It's all too easy for us as researchers to write a sentence or a statement, and we know what we're talking about, but our reader has no idea what we're trying to say. Again, when writing for a client, try to frame the research positively and help the client to understand the value of negative findings. As researchers, we also need to be reminded that it is valuable to have negative findings at times. If we've been researching in a county and there's nothing there for the individual researching, then perhaps they've moved on and it gives us a new locality to research. What do we do with the documents that we find in the course of our research? Well, a good practice is to create a document folder for the project right at the beginning of the research. So in this case, I would have created a folder titled Georgia Dawson Research Project. And then as I found each record, I would download it and give it a descriptive file name. So I have a naming protocol for my documents. I do the date first, and then the record type, then the individual's name and the location. So by doing this, all of my documents in my file line up chronologically, and then I could very easily see what I have found for each date, for each census. It's easy for me to organize it. So think of a protocol for the documents that you are finding. You don't have to do it the same way I do, but find a protocol that works for you. Maybe write it out, put it in front of your computer so that you always know how you're going to name your documents. When you're all finished with your report, you will be assembling the documents at the end of the project following the order in the report. So I like to go through my report and I will put document 1 next to the source citation, and then I will do the next source citation that has a document that goes with it. I will put document 2 and so forth. And then I take that document that I've saved in the document folder and I add the citation to the front of the document to create my documents for the client. An easy way that I have found to do this is to start a Word document or a Google Doc, to put the image of the document on the Google Doc, and then I copy and paste the source citation from the research log, adding the document number. And when I have completed putting all of the documents onto the Google Doc or Word document, I can turn that into a PDF for the client that's very easy to be read and looked at. And an electronic PDF is great because the client can enlarge the document and so they can easily read it. So in closing, here is a great quote, again by Linda K. Gulbranson. And this is from her article, Writing a Quality Research Report, which is found in the book, Becoming an Excellent Genealogist, Essays on Professional Research Skills. I highly recommend this book. It has many, many essays on different types of research skills. And in particular, this article on writing a quality research report is filled with helpful tips. So Linda says, ongoing practice in writing brief, informal reports with smaller, less complicated research projects will provide a natural way for any researcher to develop his own style of report writing. The writing process will begin to flow and feel more comfortable. So if you've never written a research report before, and this sounds very complicated and it sounds difficult, try writing something small. Write yourself a very brief, informal report. Try using all the different methods that I've talked about in this video, and just have it be maybe a 2 or 3 page report. Get used to writing up your genealogy research, and after a while it will begin to flow and it really will become easier. The more you practice, the better you're going to get, and the better genealogist you'll become through writing up your research. Thank you so much for listening to this video. I hope you've learned something about writing a research report, and I wish you the very best of luck. Thank you.